In the autumn of 1886, Thomas Kincaid was a man who operated entirely on mathematics. He lived in the deep, isolated Madison Valley of Montana Territory. Thomas was 38 years old, his face weathered into deep, permanent lines by the sun and the biting wind. He was not a cruel man, but he was a hollow one. 5 years earlier, his young wife had died of cholera on the Oregon Trail. He had buried her beneath a pile of rocks, walked the remaining 400 miles to Montana, and systematically shut down every emotional receptor in his brain. He built a cabin, he bought cattle, he fenced his land. He became a machine of pure, unfeeling efficiency. But a machine cannot run a homestead alone. Thomas needed someone to preserve the harvest, mend the canvas, and keep the fire alive while he rode the fence lines. He did not want a lover. He did not want a companion. He wanted an employee who legally could not quit. So he placed an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper. It was a masterpiece of grim honesty. He did not mention his looks. He did not mention romance. He wrote exactly this: I require a woman of strong constitution to manage a frontier household. The work is unceasing. The isolation is absolute. I offer no affections, only a legal marriage, half ownership of the deed upon my death, and a life far removed from the cities. Do not reply if you require being courted. A sensible woman would have thrown the newspaper into the fire. Margaret Hale was not sensible. She was desperate. Margaret was 31 years old, living in a squalid, overcrowded tenement in New York City. She worked in a commercial laundry, a steaming, hellish cavern where the air was so thick with lye and boiling water that her lungs constantly burned. She was alone. She was exhausted to her very bones, and she was mathematically certain that if she stayed in New York for one more winter, she would die of consumption. She read Thomas's advertisement. She did not see a cold, heartless proposal. She saw a lifeline. She wrote back with equal precision: I accept your terms. I require no affections. I require clean air, a roof that does not leak, and the assurance that I will never see the inside of a laundry house again. I will arrive in Bozeman on the 14th of October. They did not exchange photographs. They did not exchange poetry. They exchanged terms. When Margaret stepped off the train in Bozeman, the Montana wind hit her like a physical blow. She stood on the wooden platform in a plain, heavy gray dress, carrying a single carpet bag. Thomas was waiting by a buckboard wagon. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was no hesitation and there was no disappointment because there were no expectations. He walked up to her, took off his hat, and extended a calloused, dirt-stained hand. Margaret. Thomas, she replied, shaking his hand firmly. The wagon is over here. The ride is 3 days. Then we should not waste daylight. That was the entirety of their courtship. They were married by a bored county magistrate in a dusty office above a hardware store. The ceremony took 4 minutes. They did not kiss. They signed the ledger, walked down the stairs, and began the brutal journey into the Madison Valley. The first month at the homestead was a study in flawless, silent choreography. They were two traumatized people who found deep comfort in absolute routine. Margaret woke at 4 in the morning. She lit the stove, baked the bread, and hauled the water. Thomas chopped the wood, fed the livestock, and repaired the perimeter. They worked around each other like ghosts. At dinner, they sat at opposite ends of the heavy pine table. They did not discuss their pasts. They did not ask about each other's dreams. They discussed the yield of the potato crop. They discussed the price of salt. It was exactly what they had both promised. It was perfect. And then, November arrived. Historians and meteorologists now refer to the winter of 1886 and 87 as the Great Die-Up. It was a meteorological anomaly of unprecedented apocalyptic violence. It did not merely snow. The sky collapsed. It began on the 16th of November. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in a matter of hours. The wind shifted to the north, carrying a low, sustained shriek that rattled the thick log walls of the cabin. Thomas walked through the front door, his heavy buffalo coat covered in a thick layer of frost. He did not take the coat off. He looked at Margaret, who was standing by the stove. "Bring the chickens into the house," he ordered, his voice tight. Margaret blinked. "Into the house? They will ruin the floor. If they stay in the coop, they will be frozen solid by midnight. Bring them in." He turned and walked back out into the screaming wind. Margaret did not argue. She put on her heavy wool shawl and fought her way across the yard. The cold was shocking. It felt like breathing in ground glass. She hauled the terrified birds into the mudroom, locking them in. When Thomas returned 2 hours later, he had ice frozen into his beard. He barred the heavy wooden door, dropping a thick iron beam across it. They did not know it then, but that door would not open again for 3 weeks. The blizzard hit with a force that defies a modern comprehension. The snow did not fall from the sky. It drove horizontally across the plains at 60 miles an hour, a blinding, terrifying whiteout that erased the world. Inside the cabin, the temperature began a slow, relentless plunge. The structure was well built, but it was no match for 30 degrees below zero, accompanied by hurricane-force winds. The terms of their arrangement began to fracture under the weight of the cold. A homesteader named Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, who wrote extensively about her life on the frontier, perfectly described the psychological terror of such a storm in her letters. She wrote, "The wind here does not howl. It screams like a dying animal. The cold becomes a living presence in the room, sitting in the corner, waiting for the fire to go out so it can claim you." Margaret and Thomas felt that presence sitting in the corner. By the 5th day, the situation turned critical. The woodpile inside the cabin was dwindling rapidly. They had a massive cord of split pine outside, but to open the door meant letting in a wall of snow that had drifted halfway up the roof. The wind was so violent it would have ripped the door off its iron hinges. They were trapped. Thomas stopped sleeping in his bed. He dragged a heavy buffalo hide to the floor directly in front of the cast iron stove. He spent his nights staring at the small iron door, feeding it single pieces of wood with agonizing precision, trying to stretch their fuel. Margaret watched him from her bed across the room. She could see his body shaking. She could see the deep, hollow exhaustion in his eyes. He was starving himself of heat so that she could stay warm under her quilts. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a calculation. If she died, he would be alone again. But the cold did not care about calculations. By the 10th day, the frost inside the cabin was an inch thick on the inside of the windows. The water in the bucket froze solid 3 feet away from the stove. Margaret was wearing 3 dresses, a heavy wool sweater, and a shawl. Yet she could not stop shivering. Her teeth chattered so violently her jaw ached. Thomas was in worse shape. He had given her the thickest quilts. He was sitting on the floor, wrapped only in the buffalo hide, leaning against the cold iron of the stove. His lips were a pale, dangerous shade of blue. Margaret watched him from the bed. She remembered the letters. "I offer no affections. I require no affections." She looked at the man who was slowly freezing to death on her floor. She threw off the quilts. Thomas looked up, his eyes dull and unfocused. "Stay." Under the blankets, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. Margaret did not listen. She dragged the heavy quilts across the frozen floorboards. She dropped them next to him. "Move," she commanded. He stared at her, too exhausted to comprehend. Margaret didn't wait. She grabbed his arm and pulled. He was heavy, clumsy with the cold, but she forced him to slide over. She sat down on the floor, pressing her back against the wall, and pulled him down next to her. She threw the heavy quilts over both of them, trapping them together under the buffalo hide. Thomas stiffened. It was the first time they had touched since the handshake at the train station. "What are you doing?" he mumbled, his jaw locked with the cold. "I am applying logic," Margaret said, her voice shaking violently. "We have 2 bodies. We are wasting heat by separating them. If you die of frostbite, I cannot dig your grave through the floorboards. So you will stay here and you will share the heat." He did not argue. He couldn't. They sat on the floor, pressed shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, trapped beneath the heavy animal skins. The wind screamed outside, a terrifying, endless roar. At first, it was agonizingly awkward. They were 2 strangers, rigidly holding their bodies stiff, trying not to invade each other's space. But as the hours dragged on, the brutal reality of human biology took over. The shivering became violent. The cold seeped through the floorboards, threatening to pull the core temperature from their vital organs. Subconsciously, seeking survival, their bodies moved. Thomas's head dropped onto Margaret's shoulder. Margaret's arms, almost without her permission, wrapped tightly around his chest. They curled into each other, a desperate, tangled knot of limbs and wool, fighting the freezing darkness. In that forced, terrifying intimacy, the walls finally cracked. When you believe you are going to die in a dark, freezing cabin, the pride that keeps you silent suddenly seems incredibly foolish. Her name was Sarah, Thomas whispered into the dark. It was the middle of the night. The fire was nothing but a bed of dim, glowing coals. Margaret didn't move, she just held him tighter. "Your wife?" "Yes." His voice cracked, not from the cold, but from the weight of a name he hadn't spoken in 5 years. "She was 22. She begged me not to take the wagon trail. She wanted to stay in Ohio. I told her the land out here would make us rich. I killed her. It was the confession of a man who had built a fortress of silence to hide his own guilt. Margaret rested her chin against his frozen hair. She didn't offer him empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She understood the frontier too well for that. I had a child, Margaret whispered into the dark. Thomas stopped shivering. He lay perfectly still. A boy, she continued, her voice hollow. In New York. I was 19. The father vanished. He was born with weak lungs. The air in the city, the dampness in the tenement. He lived for 4 months. She took a ragged breath. I came out here because I wanted to be in a place where the air was clean. I wanted to freeze in a clean place. They lay there in the freezing dark, two fundamentally broken people having stripped away the armor of their purely transactional marriage. They had promised each other nothing but labor and shelter, but the winter had stripped them down to their absolute, raw humanity. By the 15th day, the wood ran out. Thomas fed the last splinter of pine into the stove. They watched the flames lick the wood, knowing that when those embers died, the temperature in the cabin would equalize with the outside, 30 below zero. They were going to freeze to death. Thomas looked at the stove. Then he looked around the cabin. His eyes settled on the heavy, beautifully carved oak dining table in the center of the room. It was the only piece of furniture he had brought with him from Ohio. It was the table Sarah had chosen. He didn't say a word. He stood up, letting the quilts fall away. He walked over to the corner, picked up his heavy felling axe, and walked to the center of the room. Margaret watched him from the floor. He raised the axe high above his head and brought it down with a deafening crash. The oaks splintered. He swung again and again, putting every ounce of his remaining strength into the blows, destroying the last physical memory of his old life. He gathered the shattered pieces of the table and fed them into the stove. He came back to the floor, crawling under the quilts with Margaret. He pulled her tight against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. "We are not dying in this room," he whispered fiercely. "Do you hear me? We are not dying." He wasn't speaking as an employer. He was speaking as a protector. On the 21st day, the wind finally stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and profound. The blizzard of 1886 had ended. It would leave behind a landscape littered with the frozen carcasses of millions of cattle, destroying the open-range ranching industry of the West forever. But inside the cabin, there was life. Thomas and Margaret pushed the heavy iron bar off the door. It took them an hour to dig through the massive snowdrift blocking the entrance. When they finally broke through, the blinding, brilliant Montana sun hit their faces. The world was a blinding expanse of flawless white. They stood in the doorway, squinting against the glare, leaning heavily against each other. They were filthy. They were emaciated. They were traumatized. Thomas looked down at Margaret. He looked at the woman who had shared her heat, shared her darkest secret, and held him together when the cold tried to pull him apart. He didn't offer her a grand, poetic declaration of love. He didn't drop to his knee. He reached out, took her bruised, dirt-stained hand, and kissed her knuckles. "The table is gone," he said quietly, his voice raspy. "We will have to eat on the floor until spring." Margaret looked up at him. The hard, pragmatic woman who had arrived at the train station was gone. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Then we will eat on the floor," she said. They had signed a contract for survival. They had explicitly forbidden romance. But the brutal reality of the frontier does not care about the promises we make to ourselves. Love, they discovered, is not always a spark. Sometimes love is the desperate, vital heat of another human being when the fire goes out. Sometimes love is the act of destroying your own past to keep someone else warm. They never promised to love each other, but the winter forced them to choose between remaining isolated strangers or becoming a single, unbreakable entity, and they chose to survive. If this story made you feel the cold of that cabin and the warmth of that sacrifice, I want you to think about something. Think about the moment Thomas picked up the axe and destroyed the table. Did he do it just to stay warm? Or was it the exact moment he realized Margaret's life meant more to him than his past? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Let's talk about it.